Running Sentences presents a bonus episode. A negotiated statement. Written and narrated by Michael Hunnery. Two lawyers work out an agreement per their client's request, all so they can try and settle on a statement that would be satisfactory to their party without pissing off the other one. This is a work of fiction. Any names, characters, businesses, events, and incidences within this story are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real people, real situations, real events, and/or fictional events, characters, businesses, and/or situations is purely coincidental. Copyright 2022, Michael Hunnery. All rights reserved. The conference room the two lawyers sat in was long and drawn out. The table here stretched for 50 or so feet from end to end. The room was fairly large for the two people, but it was the only neutral ground in town. Why the rented space had decided on such a room for just the two of them was beyond them, as they sat down across from one another in the exact middle of the room. "Well, this is terrible." Carla offered this as she began taking out paperwork from her briefcase. Donald was doing much the same, and nodded his agreement as he made sure that all his things were where he wanted them to be. If anything looked out of place, he would move all of his files, pens, and notepads about until they looked about right, or not take them out of his briefcase at all. He was never quite satisfied, though, with how things looked, and kept moving things about just ever so slightly to keep himself happy. "Are your clients open to agreeing to things?" Carla asked. Her stuff was mostly slapdashed onto the table with little care for where it landed, although there was still quite a lot left in her briefcase. She opened the file in front of her on her client and started to leaf through the papers to see what was what, and what there was to see, if she could find it. "Depends on if your clients are willing to agree to things as well. We both know that this is a two-way street," he said back. His stare had yet to leave his carefully placed items, as his hand hovered over his area, ready to move things about again if they looked off. "Yes, that is fully noted, and they are ready to talk about how we might agree to things if I can find my files." Mr. Donald finally looked up, perturbed and a little annoyed when he saw her side of the conference table. Things were strewn about here and there, and he desperately wanted to reach over and organize things, but he kept his hands to himself. "Do you know what the case is?" She looked up at him with a raised eyebrow disdainfully, wondering why he was asking such a question. "Of course I know. It's something to do with a disagreement and name-calling, maybe?" He stared hard at her as he opened his own file and looked down at the first paper on it. A neatly bullet-pointed summary was provided there, running down the situation. His finger ran over a few lines of details to make sure he knew exactly what was going on, and so that he didn't look like a fool. "Yes, a disagreement. Two family members that got into it on social media website about how things were being handled amongst the family." Carla flipped through a bunch of papers before settling on something and pulling them out of the folder to spread before her. The table had plenty of room, so he couldn't really see over to her side, even though he was peering in that direction. He couldn't exactly make out what was from on her side, and she likewise could not make out on his. "Yes, that's right. Now, one family member went to get advice online about how to handle a relationship problem on a popular website?" she asked. He nodded along. "It was a discussion website about how one of them had talked about their problems without trying to hide who they were." He said this with a firm nod, as his finger went over those little bullet-pointed points again. They both stopped looking at their notes so that they could see each other nod on that this was what this was about. When they both nodded yes, they grabbed notebooks and moved them to the forefront so that they could be written upon. A flurry of papers were also drawn out from their respective files, and then things settled down as they looked over these one by one. "Okay." Okay, so my client claims your client called him a sucker and a spendthrift who would let money sift through them at the slightest idea of a get-rich scheme, Carla said, as she began writing something down on her notepad. Isn't a spendthrift a person who doesn't like to spend money? Donald countered this. He was sure he had heard the term before, but he wasn't quite sure. No, they lavishly spend money on silly things. She replied this quickly, as she then grabbed at a bunch of papers that were next to her. Donald made a note of that in his notebook, along with circling the word. He figured it would be a good talking point at some point to negotiate over. After all, no one likes fancy words thrown at them. Your client also made claims about my client that it should be put out they were not appreciated, things along the line of, a no good goody do-goody who can't get out of their own way, a waste of space of niceness, too nice for their own good. Donald parroted this from his bullet-pointed paper that he was reading. So on, and there are plenty of other examples to go along with as well. It was Carla's turn to write furiously into her notebook, taking down these words and circling things here and there. All good points of knowledge to have that probably wouldn't be useful in the slightest. One never knew, though, so it was best to grab what they could and run with it, just in case. I see, there are no serious claims, but serious enough for the events would bring in a mediator to formulate a way to peace. She said this as she finished up writing up one last thing. A second later, though, she was once again looking through her papers for something. This time, she was looking for what her client wished to gain out of all of this. The problem was that her client had given her a scrap of paper, a piece which was tiny, insignificant, and yet ever so important, which was now lost among the many pieces of paper that she had. Where did that thing get off to? Carla was muttering this to herself as she shuffled through paper after paper. I do not have all the time in the world. We have several of these to get through, Donald replied as he took out a variety of folders from his briefcase. The stack of them hit the conference table with a thud. Yes, but this I need since it involves a statement from my client requesting what they want out of this. I can't exactly make up what they want, and they will just go along with it and be okay with it. Now can I? She said this rather annoyed. The papers in her hands went flying the more she searched, as they left her grasp and floated up into the air, and then slowly downward. A few came down onto the table, while others made their way towards the floor. In all of this mayhem, Donald managed to notice a scrap of paper come away and floating down near the conference room phone that was in front of them. Ahem, I think I have found what you're looking for, he said this, and began pointing towards something. She looked up, surprised and worried, with a paper in each hand ready to toss them to the side. Her gaze fell onto him for a second. Not seeing the scrap of paper right away, she tossed the paper in her right hand, and then the one in her left to see if they were somehow attached to the note. There still was no note, and she was about to ask how he knew where it was. She spotted him, pointing towards it on the table. Oh, there it is, she said, and grabbed it up. Okay, let's see. She demands restitution and a public statement, withdrawing all comments from public messaging boards. Simple enough. Carla then went back to her papers, looking through them for something new, while Donald looked on, trying to figure out what she was up to now. I take it then we are going to ask for our standard operational fill-in the apology form, he asked. She nodded and tossed a few more papers into the air, which floated about her as she continued her search. All Donald wanted to do was sigh and began to look through his other papers. This day was not going well, but maybe if he got out the slip of paper, it would make things simpler for all. He cracked open his briefcase once again and began his own search, which was turning more and more frantic the more he had to look. The folder he wanted should be right on top. Yet it wasn't there, and he felt a panic flash through him. We are going with the fill-in-the-blanks form, yes, right. Yeah, that's what you asked. Like, the ones like those games where you fill in the ones with words, Or do you have an already filled out apology that you're just wanting to sign off on? Carla asked this as her own search finished. She held it aloft, this piece of paper in her hands, and looked it over with the blank spots for words in it littered throughout the document. Carla then placed it onto the table and fished out a pen, putting in some appropriate words on her paper while she waited for the answer from him.
Jesus, that took longer than I wanted it to. Donald said this and slapped down his own piece of paper onto the table with a glare at it.
Why it had taken so long and why it had been out of place was quite the question for him, but he didn't have time to answer it. Are you going to answer my question?
Oh, yes, we're doing the yes as I asked as well. It's a standard operating fill in the blanks to make things look smart and official. Everyone will question the authenticity of them and not care about them 3 seconds after reading them, he replied, as he pulled out a pen from his pocket and began filling in his form as well.
Clients aren't famous, so of course no one will pay attention to it. Carla said this with a sigh as she finished filling out the paper and then glanced over it to make sure that it was all looking nice and proper and semi-official anyway. She then pushed it and shoved it across the way towards him, but was not having much success with that.
I don't think that is right, actually.
A shared look of doubt between them shifted down to their paper notes. A quick shuffle of papers were went through as they looked up something between them. It took a minute for his, but he got there and he settled on a piece of paper.
My client is Bebop the artist and is seeking an apology, a retraction from his own family member about some stuff. He is a bit famous if you consider certain parts of town who really, really like him.
Carla spent a few more seconds before getting through her papers in order to look over hers. That wasn't the case I was talking about now. We have a different case?
Do you have this case?
Came the urgent questioning and reply from Donald, who feared he was now in the wrong place. Yes, he was negotiating cases and apologies with attorney-at-law Carla Foreboding, but was it the wrong day to be here? And, well, he knew it was the right day. He had piles of files to go through that were all seeking apologies. Yes, I believe so, but I thought we were doing the case of Ben and Barbara first. Are we doing this in alphabetical order, or what is it we're doing? She said this and waved the paper with the complaint from her client in front of him. Donald snatched it up from her grasp and glanced over it with all the information looking familiar, but slightly different. He relaxed and put the paper down so that he could nod to her. He definitely had this file, so she, too, began to look relieved. Well, which one do we do first, then, since we both have the same clients?
Why not just keep doing the one I was doing, I guess. It's just a standard apology form with a fill in the blanks, right? He asked back.
She nodded and pulled out a new of her own standard forms to begin filling that one in, and realized that she was actually filling in much of the same things she had written on the previous one. For a second, Carla would stop, and then kept writing quickly to fill in the sheet with a flourish. She was done, signed it, and turned it over to Donald, who finished his sheet and gave it to her. This seemed all good and proper. The clients wanted an apology, and an apology they had, so she felt. How many apologies do we have to get through the latest row of internet interactions because of the latest new government law? She asked this as she began pulling out more and more papers, realizing she would need more and more papers. Donald paused as he drew out one of the apology forms from his case, and was getting to fill it out with slightly new different words, and slightly different, but it would do. He thought about it, some ticking of his head from side to side to make sure that he knew everything that he needed to know.
Well, since the new law dictates that everyone be nice, and they have to apologize to one another for past indiscretions on the internet, I'd say probably a couple hundred or so in this case, especially since all those past transgressions must also be apologized for.
Do you think anyone would notice if these are all just the same standard forms? They all read the same or something like that?
I mean, literally, since everyone has to apologize, no one is going to pay attention. Carla said this, waving her pen about, thinking very hard while biting her lip. No one will know? He asked. How would they? She countered this, still waving her pen about. Well, they might read the apologies. He said this back and sat back in his chair to think for a second. There was a pause as they both considered this, before Carla spoke up again. I think that the people already know that these will be standard form-like things. They're not really expecting anything. They aren't expecting anything for the measly amount of money that they have to pay up. If I had to guess, they just want to have this done and over with, all so that they can get the proof that they did what was required and that they aren't going to fall guilty of the new government law. Yes, that sounds about right for the level of government that thinks this new law is okay. Although I think the lawyers did lobby for it to have a little extra business under them and keep themselves busy with stuff. So fine, let's do this. But, do make sure that they are a little different from one another, aside from the names. He said this and began to look through his files and bring out more and more of these apology forms. There was an affirmative nod from Carla, and the two began to scribble whatever names and words onto each sheet as fast as they could. The end of A Negotiated Statement. Thank you for listening.